Section 3 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, Part 1, Desrues, by Alexandre Dumas, translated by George Burnham Ives. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 3. The cure and the monk arrived just as Monsieur de Lamotte folded his wife in his arms. Although she had passed her 40th year, she was still beautiful enough to justify her husband's eulogism. A moderate plumpness had preserved the freshness and softness of her skin. Her smile was charming, and her large blue eyes expressed both gentleness and goodness. Seen beside this smiling and serene countenance, the appearance of the stranger was downright repulsive, and Monsieur de Lamotte could hardly repress a start of disagreeable surprise at the pitiful and sordid aspect of this diminutive person, who stood apart, looking overwhelmed by conscious inferiority. He was still more astonished when he saw his son take him by the hand with friendly kindness, and heard him say— "Will you come with me, my friend? We will follow my father and mother." Madame de Lamotte, having greeted the cure, looked at the monk, who was a stranger to her. A word or two explained matters, and she took her husband's arm, declining to answer any questions until she reached the house, and laughing at his curiosity. Pierre Etienne de Saint Faust de Lamotte, one of the king's equerries, seigneur of Grange Flandre, Valperfond, etc., had married Marie Francois Perrier in 1760. Their fortune resembled many others of that period. It was more nominal than actual, more showy than solid. Not that the husband and wife had any cause for self-reproach, or that their estates had suffered from dissipation. Unstained by the corrupt manners of the period, their union had been a model of sincere affection, of domestic virtue and mutual confidence. Marie Francoise was quite beautiful enough to have made a sensation in society, but she renounced it of her own accord, in order to devote herself to the duties of a wife and mother. The only serious grief she and her husband had experienced was the loss of two young children. Edouard, though delicate from his birth, had nevertheless passed the trying years of infancy and early adolescence. He was then nearly 14. With a sweet and rather effeminate expression, blue eyes, and a pleasant smile, he was a striking likeness of his mother. His father's affection exaggerated the dangers which threatened the boy, and in his eyes the slightest indisposition became a serious malady. His mother shared these fears, and in consequence of this anxiety, Edouard's education had been much neglected. He had been brought up at Buisson-Souef, and allowed to run wild from morning till night, like a young fawn, exercising the vigour and activity of its limbs. He had still the simplicity and general ignorance of a child of 9 or 10. The necessity of appearing at court, and suitably defraying the expenses of his office, had made great inroads on Monsieur de Lamotte's fortune. He had of late lived at Buisson-Souef in the most complete retirement, but notwithstanding this too long deferred attention to his affairs, his property was ruining him, for the place required a large expenditure, and absorbed a large amount of his income without making any tangible return. He had always hesitated to dispose of the estate on account of its associations. It was there he had met, courted, and married his beloved wife; there that the happy days of their youth had been spent; there that they both wished to grow old together. Such was the family to which accident had now introduced Desrues. The unfavourable impression made on Monsieur de Lamotte had not passed unperceived by him, but, being quite accustomed to the instinctive repugnance which his first appearance generally inspired, Desrues had made a successful study of how to combat and efface this antagonistic feeling, and replace it by confidence, using different means according to the persons he had to deal with. He understood at once that vulgar methods would be useless with Monsieur de Lamotte, whose appearance and manners indicated both the man of the world and the man of intelligence; and also he had to consider the two priests, who were both observing him attentively. Fearing a false step, he assumed the most simple and insignificant deportment he could, knowing that sooner or later a third person would rehabilitate him in the opinion of those present. Nor did he wait long. Arrived at the drawing-room, Monsieur de Lamotte requested the company to be seated. Desrues acknowledged the courtesy by a bow, and there was a moment of silence while Edouard and his mother looked at each other and smiled. The silence was broken by Madame de Lamotte. "Dear Pierre," she said, "you are surprised to see us accompanied by a stranger, but when you hear what he has done for us,
You will thank me for having induced him to return here with us."
"Allow me," interrupted Desrues, "allow me to tell you what happened. The gratitude which madame imagines she owes me causes her to exaggerate a small service which anybody would have been delighted to render."
"No, monsieur, let me tell it." "Let mamma tell the story," said Edouard. "What is it, then? What happened?" said Monsieur de Lamotte.
"I am quite ashamed," answered Desrues, "but I obey your wishes, madame."
"Yes," replied Madame de Lamotte. "Keep your seat, I wish it. Imagine, Pierre, just 6 days ago an accident happened to Edouard and me, which might have had serious consequences."
"And you never wrote to me, Marie?"
"I should only have made you anxious, and to no purpose. I had some business in one of the most crowded parts of Paris. I took a chair, and Edouard walked beside me. In the rue Beaubourg we were suddenly surrounded by a mob of low people, who were quarrelling. Carriages stopped the way, and the horses of one of these took fright in the confusion and uproar, and bolted in spite of the coachman's endeavours to keep them in hand. It was a horrible tumult, and I tried to get out of the chair, but at that moment the chairmen were both knocked down, and I fell. It is a miracle I was not crushed. I was dragged insensible from under the horses' feet, and carried into the house before which all this took place. There, sheltered in a shop and safe from the crowd which encumbered the doorway, I recovered my senses, thanks to the assistance of Monsieur Desrues, who lives there. But that is not all. When I recovered I could not walk. I had been so shaken by the fright, the fall, and the danger I had incurred, and I had to accept his offer of finding me another chair when the crowd should disperse, and meanwhile to take shelter in his rooms with his wife, who showed me the kindest attention."
"Monsieur," said Monsieur de Lamotte, rising, but his wife stopped him.
"Wait a moment, I have not finished yet. Monsieur Desrues came back in an hour, and I was then feeling better, but before I left I was stupid enough to say that I had been robbed in the confusion. My diamond earrings, which had belonged to my mother, were gone. You cannot imagine the trouble Monsieur Desrues took to discover the thief, and all the appeals he made to the police. I was really ashamed."
Although Monsieur de Lamotte did not yet understand what motive, other than gratitude, had induced his wife to bring this stranger home with her, he again rose from his seat, and going to Desrues, held out his hand. "I understand now the attachment my son shows for you. You are wrong in trying to lessen your good deed in order to escape from our gratitude, Monsieur Desrues." "Monsieur Desrues?" inquired the monk.
"Do you know the name, my father?"
asked Madame Lamotte eagerly. "Edouard had already told me," said the monk, approaching Desrues. "You live in the rue Beaubourg, and you are Monsieur Desrues, formerly a retail grocer?" "The same, my brother." "Should you require a reference, I can give it. Chance, madame, has made you acquainted with a man whose reputation for piety and honour is well established. He will permit me to add my praises to yours." "Indeed, I do not know how I deserve so much honour." "I am Brother Marchois, of the Camaldulian order. You see that I know you well." The monk then proceeded to explain that his community had confided their affairs to Desrues' honesty, he undertaking to dispose of the articles manufactured by the monks in their retreat. He then recounted a number of good actions and of marks of piety, which were heard with pleasure and admiration by those present. Desrues received this cloud of incense with appearance of sincere modesty and humility, which would have deceived the most skilful physiognomist. When the eulogistic warmth of the good brother began to slacken, it was already nearly dark, and the two priests had barely time to regain the presbytery without incurring the risk of breaking their necks in the rough road which led to it. They departed at once, and a room was got ready for Desrues.
"Tomorrow," said Madame de Lamotte, as they separated, "you can discuss with my husband the business on which you came. Tomorrow or another day, for I beg that you will make yourself at home here, and the longer you will stay, the better it will please us."
The night was a sleepless one for Desrues, whose brain was occupied by a confusion of criminal plans. The chance which had caused his acquaintance with Madame de Lamotte, and even more the accident of Brother Marchois appearing in the nick of time to enlarge upon the praises which gave him so excellent a character, seemed like favourable omens not to be neglected. He began to imagine fresh villainies, to outline an unheard of crime, which as yet he could not definitely trace out. But anyhow, there would be plunder to seize and blood to spill, and the spirit of murder excited and kept him awake, just as remorse might have troubled the repose of another. Meanwhile, Madame de Lamotte, having retired with her husband, was saying to the latter—
"Well, now, what do you think of my protege, or rather, of the protector which Heaven sent me?"
"I think that physiognomy is often very deceptive, for I should have been quite willing to hang him on the strength of his."
"It is true that his appearance is not attractive, and it led me into a foolish mistake which I quickly regretted. When I recovered consciousness and saw him attending on me, much worse and more carelessly dressed than he is today."
"You were frightened?"
"No, not exactly, but I thought I must be indebted to a man of the lowest class, to some poor fellow who was really starving, and my first effort at gratitude was to offer him a piece of gold."
"Did he refuse it?"
"No, he accepted it for the poor of the parish. Then he told me his name, Cyrano Desrues de Bury, and told me that the shop and the goods it contained were his own property, and that he occupied an apartment in the house. I floundered in excuses, but he replied that he blessed the mistake, inasmuch as it would enable him to relieve some unfortunate people. I was so touched with his goodness that I offered him a second piece of gold."
"You were quite right, my dear, but what induced you to bring him to Buisson? I should have gone to see and thank him the first time I went to Paris, and meanwhile a letter would have been sufficient. Did he carry his complaisance and interest so far as to offer you his escort?"
"Ah, I can see you cannot get over your first impression. Honestly, is it not so?"
"Indeed," exclaimed Monsieur de Lamotte, laughing heartily, "it is truly unlucky for a decent man to have such a face as that. He ought to give Providence no rest until he obtains the gift of another countenance."
"Always these prejudices. It is not the poor man's fault that he was born like that."
"Well, you said something about business we were to discuss together. What is it?"
"I believe he can help us to obtain the money we are in want of."
"And who told him that we wanted any?"
"I did."
"You? Come, it certainly seems that this gentleman is to be a family friend. And pray, what induced you to confide in him to this extent?"
"You would have known by now if you did not interrupt. Let me tell you all in order. The day after my accident I went out with Edouard about midday, and I went to again express my gratitude for his kindness. I was received by Madame Derues, who told me your husband was out, and that he had gone to my hotel to inquire after me and my son, and also to see if anything had been heard of my stolen earrings. She appeared a simple and very ordinary sort of person, and she begged me to sit down and wait for her husband. I thought it would be uncivil not to do so, and Monsieur Derues appeared in about 2 hours. The first thing he did, after having saluted me and inquired most particularly after my health, was to ask for his children, 2 charming little things, fresh and rosy, whom he covered with kisses. We talked about indifferent matters. Then he offered me his services, placed himself at my disposal, and begged me to spare neither his time nor his trouble. I then told him what had brought me to Paris, and also the disappointments I had encountered, for of all the people I had seen not one had given me a favourable answer. He said that he might possibly be of some use to me, and the very next day told me that he had seen a capitalist, but could do nothing without more precise information. Then I thought it might be better to bring him here, so that he might talk matters over with you. When I first asked him, he refused altogether, and only yielded to my earnest entreaties and Edouard's. This is the history, dear, of the circumstances under which I made Monsieur Derues' acquaintance. I hope you do not think I have acted foolishly."
"Very well," said Monsieur de Lamotte. I will talk to him tomorrow, and in any case I promise you I will be civil to him. I will not forget that he has been useful to you." With which promise the conversation came to a close. Skilled in assuming any kind of mask, and in playing every sort of part, Desrues did not find it difficult to overcome Monsieur de Lamotte's prejudices, and in order to obtain the goodwill of the father he made a skilful use of the friendship which the son had formed with him. One can hardly think that he already meditated the crime which he carried out later. One prefers to believe that these atrocious plots were not invented so long beforehand. But he was already a prey to the idea, and nothing henceforth could turn him from it. By what route he should arrive at the distant goal which his greed foresaw, he knew not as yet, but he had said to himself, "One day this property shall be mine." It was the death warrant of those who owned it. We have no details, no information as to Derues' first visit to Buisson-Souef, but when he departed he had obtained the complete confidence of the family, and a regular correspondence was carried on between him and the Lamottes. It was thus that he was able to exercise his talent of forgery, and succeeded in imitating the writing of this unfortunate lady, so as to be able even to deceive her husband. Several months passed, and none of the hopes which Derues had inspired were realized. A loan was always on the point of being arranged, and regularly failed because of some unforeseen circumstance. These pretended negotiations were managed by Derues with so much skill and cunning that instead of being suspected, he was pitied for having so much useless trouble. Meanwhile, Monsieur de Lamotte's money difficulties increased, and the sale of Buisson-Souef became inevitable. Derues offered himself as a purchaser, and actually acquired the property by private contract dated December 1775. It was agreed between the parties that the purchase money of 130,000 livres should not be paid until 1776, in order to allow Derues to collect the various sums at his disposal. It was an important purchase, which, he said, he only made on account of his interest in Monsieur de Lamotte and his wish to put an end to the latter's difficulties. But when the period agreed on arrived, towards the middle of 1776, Derues found it impossible to pay. It is certain that he never meant to do so, and a special peculiarity of this dismal story is the avarice of the man, the passion for money which overruled all his actions, and occasionally caused him to neglect necessary prudence. Enriched by 3 bankruptcies, by continual thefts, by usury, the gold he acquired promptly seemed to disappear. He stuck at nothing to obtain it, and once in his grasp he never let it go again. Frequently he risked the loss of his character for honest dealing rather than relinquish a fraction of his wealth. According to many credible people, it was generally believed by his contemporaries that this monster possessed treasures which he had buried in the ground, the hiding place of which no one knew, not even his wife. Perhaps it is only a vague and unfounded rumour which should be rejected, or is it, perhaps, a truth which failed to reveal itself? It would be strange if after the lapse of half a century the hiding place were to open and give up the fruit of his rapine. Who knows whether some of this treasure, accidentally discovered, may not have founded fortunes whose origin is unknown, even to their possessors? Although it was of the utmost importance not to arouse Monsieur de Lamotte's suspicions, just at the moment when he ought to be paying him so large a sum, Derues was actually at this time being sued by his creditors. But in those days ordinary lawsuits had no publicity; they struggled and died between the magistrates and advocates without causing any sound. In order to escape the arrest and detention with which he was threatened, he took refuge at Buisson-Souef with his family, and remained there from Whitsuntide till the end of November. After being treated all this time as a friend, Derues departed for Paris, in order, he said, to receive an inheritance which would enable him to pay the required purchase money. This pretended inheritance was that of one of his wife's relations, Monsieur Despeigne du Plessis, who had been murdered in his country house near Beauvais. It has been strongly suspected that Derues was guilty of this crime. There are, however, no positive proofs, and we prefer only to class it as a simple possibility. Derues had made formal promises to Monsieur de Lamotte, and it was no longer possible for him to elude them. Either the payment must now be made or the contract annulled. A new correspondence began between the creditors and the debtor. Friendly letters were exchanged, full of protestations on one side and confidence on the other. But all Desrues' skill could only obtain a delay of a few months. At length Monsieur de Lamotte, unable to leave Buisson-Souef himself, on account of important business which required his presence, gave his wife a power of attorney, consented to another separation, and sent her to Paris, accompanied by Edouard, and, as if to hasten their misfortunes, sent notice of their coming to the expectant murderer. We have passed quickly over the interval between the first meeting of Monsieur de Lamotte and Desrues and the moment when the victims fell into the trap. We might easily have invented long conversations and episodes which would have brought Desrues' profound hypocrisy into greater relief, but the reader now knows all that we care to show him. We have purposely lingered in our narration in the endeavour to explain the perversities of this mysterious organization. We have overloaded it with all the facts which seem to throw any light upon this sombre character. But now, after these long preparations, the drama opens. The scenes become rapid and lifelike. Events, long impeded, accumulate and pass quickly before us. The action is connected and hastens to an end. We shall see Desrues like an unwearied Proteus, changing names, costumes, language, multiplying himself in many forms, scattering deceptions and lies from one end of France to the other, and finally, after so many efforts, such prodigies of calculation and activity, end by wrecking himself against a corpse. The letter written at Buisson-Souef arrived at Paris the morning of the 14th of December. In the course of the day an unknown man presented himself at the hotel where Madame Lamotte and her son had stayed before, and inquired what rooms were vacant. There were 4, and he engaged them for a certain Dumoulin, who had arrived that morning from Bordeaux, and who had passed through Paris in order to meet at some little distance relations who would return with him. A part of the rent was paid in advance, and it was expressly stipulated that until his return the rooms should not be let to anyone, as the aforesaid Dumoulin might return with his family and require them at any moment. The same person went to other hotels in the neighbourhood and engaged vacant rooms, sometimes for a stranger he expected, sometimes for friends whom he could not accommodate himself. At about 3 o'clock the Place de Grève was full of people. Thousands of heads crowded the windows of the surrounding houses. A parricide was to pay the penalty of his crime, a crime committed under atrocious circumstances, with an unheard of refinement of barbarity. The punishment corresponded to the crime. The wretched man was broken on the wheel, and the most complete and terrible silence prevailed in the multitude eager for ghastly emotions. 3 times already had been heard the heavy thud of the instrument which broke the victim's limbs, and a loud cry escaped the sufferer which made all who hear it shudder with horror. One man only, who in spite of all his efforts could not get through the crowd and cross the square, remained unmoved, and looking contemptuously towards the criminal, muttered, "Idiot! He was unable to deceive anyone." A few moments later the flames began to rise from the funeral pile. The crowd began to move, and the man was able to make his way through and reach one of the streets leading out of the square. The sky was overcast, and the grey daylight hardly penetrated the narrow lane, hideous and gloomy as the name it bore, and which only a few years ago still wound like a long serpent through the mire of this quarter. Just then it was deserted, owing to the attraction of the execution close by. The man who had just left the square proceeded slowly, attentively, reading all the inscriptions on the doors. He stopped at number 75, where on the threshold of a shop sat a stout woman busily knitting, over whom one read in big yellow letters, "Widow Masson." He saluted the woman and asked, "Is there not a cellar to let in this house?"
"There is, master,"
answered the widow. "Can I speak to the owner?"
"And that is myself, by your leave."
"Will you show me the cellar? I am a provincial wine merchant. My business often brings me to Paris, and I want a cellar where I could deposit wine which I sell on commission." They went down together. After examining the place and ascertaining that it was not too damp for the expensive wine which he wished to leave there, the man agreed about the rent, paid the first term in advance, and was entered on the widow Masson's books under the name of Ducoudray. It is hardly necessary to remark that it should have been Desrues. When he returned home in the evening, his wife told him that a large box had arrived. "It is all right," he said. "The carpenter from whom I ordered it is a man of his word." Then he supped and caressed his children. The next day, being Sunday, he received the communion, to the great edification of the devout people of the neighbourhood. On Monday the 16th, Madame de Lamotte and Edouard, descending from the Montereau stagecoach, were met by Desrues and his wife.
"Did my husband write to you, Monsieur Desrues?"
inquired Madame de Lamotte.
"Yes, madame, 2 days ago, and I have arranged our dwelling for your reception."
"What? But did not Monsieur de Lamotte ask you to engage the rooms I have had before in the Hotel de France?"
"He did not say so, and if that was your idea, I trust you will change it. Do not deprive me of the pleasure of offering you the hospitality for which so long I have accepted from you. Your room is quite ready, also one for this dear boy."
And so saying, he took Edouard's hand.
"And I am sure, if you ask his opinion, he will say you had better be content to stay with me."
"Undoubtedly," said the boy, "and I do not see why there need be any hesitation between friends."
Whether by accident or secret presentiment, or because she foresaw a possibility of business discussions between them, Madame de Lamotte objected to this agreement. Desrues, having a business appointment which he was bound to keep, desired his wife to accompany the Lamottes to the Hotel de France, and in case of their not being able to find rooms there, mentioned 3 others as the only ones in the quarter where they could be comfortably accommodated. 2 hours later, Madame de Lamotte and her son returned to his house in the rue Beaubourg. The house which Desrues occupied stood opposite the rue des Menoriers, and was pulled down quite lately to make way for the rue Rambuteau. In 1776 it was one of the finest houses of the rue Beaubourg, and it required a certain income to be able to live there, the rents being tolerably high. A large arched doorway gave admittance to a passage, lighted at the other end by a small court, on the far side of which was the shop into which Madame de Lamotte had been taken on the occasion of the accident. The house staircase was to the right of the passage, and the Desrues' dwelling on the entresol. The first room, lighted by a window looking into the court, was used as a dining room, and led into a simply furnished sitting room, such as was generally found among the bourgeois and tradespeople of this period. To the right of the sitting room was a large closet, which could serve as a small study, or could hold a bed. To the left was a door opening into the Desrues' bedroom, which had been prepared for Madame de Lamotte. Madame Desrues would occupy one of the 2 beds which stood in the alcove. Desrues made a bed up in the sitting room, and Edouard was accommodated in the little study. Nothing particular happened during the first few days which followed the Lamotte's arrival. They had not come to Paris only on account of the Buisson Souef affairs. Edouard was nearly 16, and after much hesitation his parents had decided on placing him in some school where his hitherto neglected education might receive more attention. Desrues undertook to find a capable tutor, in whose house the boy would be brought up in the religious feeling which the cure of Buisson and his own exhortations had already tended to develop. These proceedings, added to Madame de Lamotte's endeavours to collect various sums due to her husband, took some time. Perhaps, when on the point of executing a terrible crime, Desrues tried to postpone that fatal moment, although, considering his character, this seems unlikely, for one cannot do him the honour of crediting him with a single moment of remorse, doubt, or pity. Far from it. It appears from all the information which can be gathered, that Desrues, faithful to his own traditions, was simply experimenting on his unfortunate guests, for no sooner were they in his house than both began to complain of constant nausea, which they had never suffered from before. While he thus ascertained the strength of their constitution, he was able, knowing the cause of the malady, to give them relief, so that Madame de Lamotte, although she grew daily weaker, had so much confidence in him as to think it unnecessary to call in a doctor. Fearing to alarm her husband, she never mentioned her sufferings, and her letters only spoke of the care and kind attention which she received. On the 15th of January, 1777, Edouard was placed in a school in the rue de l'Homme Arme. His mother never saw him again. She went out once more to place her husband's power of attorney with a lawyer in the rue de Paon. On her return she felt so weak and broken down that she was obliged to go to bed and remain there for several days. On January 29th, the unfortunate lady had risen, and was sitting near the window which overlooked the deserted rue des Menetriers, where clouds of snow were drifting before the wind. Who can guess the sad thoughts which may have possessed her? All around dark, cold, and silent, tending to produce painful depression and involuntary dread. To escape the gloomy ideas which besieged her, her mind went back to the smiling times of her youth and marriage. She recalled the time when, alone at Buisson during her husband's enforced absences, she wandered with her child in the cool and shaded walks of the park, and sat out in the evening inhaling the scent of the flowers, and listening to the murmur of the water, or the sound of the whispering breeze in the leaves. Then, coming back from these sweet recollections to reality, she shed tears, and called on her husband and son. So deep was her reverie that she did not hear the room door open, did not perceive that darkness had come on. The light of a candle, dispersing the shadows, made her start. She turned her head and saw Desrues coming toward her. He smiled, and she made an effort to keep back the tears which were shining in her eyes, and appear calm. "I am afraid I disturb you," he said. "I came to ask a favour, madame."
"What is it, Monsieur Desrues?" she inquired.
"Will you allow me to have a large chest brought into this room? I ought to pack some valuable things in it, which are in my charge, and are now in this cupboard. I am afraid it will be in your way."
"Is it not your own house, and is it not rather I who am in the way and a cause of trouble? Pray have it brought in, and try to forget that I am here. You are most kind to me, but I wish I could spare you all this trouble, and that I were fit to go back to Buisson. I had a letter from my husband yesterday."
"We will talk about that presently, if you wish it," said Desrues. "I will go and fetch the servant to help me to carry in this chest. I have put it off hitherto, but it really must be sent in 3 days." He went away and returned in a few minutes. The chest was carried in, and placed before the cupboard at the foot of the bed. Alas! the poor lady little thought it was her own coffin which stood before her. The maid withdrew, and Desrues assisted Madame de Lamotte to a seat near the fire, which he revived with more fuel. He sat down opposite to her, and by the feeble light of the candle placed on a small table between them, could contemplate at leisure the ravages wrought by poison on her wasted features. "I saw your son to-day," he said. "He complains that you neglect him, and have not seen him for 12 days. He does not know you have been ill, nor did I tell him. The dear boy! He loves you so tenderly."
"And I also long to see him. My friend, I cannot tell you what terrible presentiments beset me. It seems as if I were threatened with some great misfortune, and just now, when you came in, I could think only of death. What is the cause of this languor and weakness? It is surely no temporary ailment. Tell me the truth. Am I not dreadfully altered? And do you not think my husband will be shocked when he sees me like this?"
"You are unnecessarily anxious," replied Desrues. "It is rather a failing of yours. Did I not see you last year tormenting yourself about Edouard's health, when he was not even thinking of being ill? I am not so soon alarmed. My own old profession, and that of chemistry, which I studied in my youth, have given me some acquaintance with medicine. I have frequently been consulted, and have prescribed for patients whose condition was supposed to be desperate, and I can assure you I have never seen a better and stronger constitution than yours. Try to calm yourself, and do not call up chimeras, because a mind at ease is the greatest enemy of illness. This depression will pass, and you will regain your strength."
"May God grant it, for I feel weaker every day."
"We have still some business to transact together. The notary at Beauvais writes that the difficulties which prevented his paying over the inheritance of my wife's relation, Monsieur Duplessis, have mostly disappeared. I have 100,000 livres at my disposal, that is to say, at yours, and in a month at latest I shall be able to pay off my debt. You ask me to be sincere," he continued with a tinge of reproachful irony. "Be sincere in your turn, madame, and acknowledge that you and your husband have both felt uneasy, and that the delays I have been obliged to ask for have not seemed very encouraging to you."
"It is true," she replied, "but we never questioned your good faith."
"And you were right. One is not always able to carry out one's intentions. Events can always upset our calculations, but what really is in our power is the desire to do right, to be honest, and I can say that I never intentionally wronged anyone. And now I am happy in being able to fulfill my promises to you. I trust when I am the owner of Buisson Souef, you will not feel obliged to leave it."
"Thank you. I should like to come occasionally, for all my happy recollections are connected with it. Is it necessary for me to accompany you to Beauvais?"
"Why should you not? The change would do you good." She looked up at him and smiled sadly.
"I am not in a fit state to undertake it."
"Not if you imagine that you are unable, certainly. Come, have you any confidence in me?"
"The most complete confidence, as you know."
"Very well, then, trust to my care. This very evening I will prepare a draft for you to take tomorrow morning, and I will even now fix the duration of this terrible malady which frightens you so much. In 2 days I shall fetch Edouard from his school to celebrate the beginning of your convalescence, and we will start, at latest, on February 1st. You are astonished at what I say, but you shall see if I am not a good doctor, and much cleverer than many who pass for such merely because they have obtained a diploma."
"Then, doctor, I will place myself in your hands."
"Remember what I say. You will leave this on February 1st."
"To begin this cure, can you ensure my sleeping tonight?"
"Certainly. I will go now and send my wife to you. She will bring a draught, which you must promise to take."
"I will exactly follow your prescriptions. Good night, my friend."
"Good night, madame, and take courage."
And bowing low, he left the room. The rest of the evening was spent in preparing the fatal medicine. The next morning, an hour or two after Madame de Lamotte had swallowed it, the maid who had given it to her came and told Derues the invalid was sleeping very heavily and snoring, and asked if she ought to be awoke. He went into the room, and, opening the curtains, approached the bed. He listened for some time, and recognised that the supposed snoring was really the death rattle. He sent the servant off to the country with a letter to one of his friends, telling her not to return until the Monday following, February 3rd. He also sent away his wife, on some unknown pretext, and remained alone with his victim. So terrible a situation ought to have troubled the mind of the most hardened criminal. A man familiar with murder and accustomed to shed blood might have felt his heart sink, and in the absence of pity might have experienced disgust at the sight of this prolonged and useless torture. But Derues, calm and easy, as if unconscious of evil, sat coolly beside the bed, as any doctor might have done. From time to time he felt the slackening pulse, and looked at the glassy and sightless eyes which turned in their orbits, and he saw without terror the approach of night, which rendered this awful tete-a-tete even more horrible. The most profound silence reigned in the house. The street was deserted, and the only sound heard was caused by an icy rain mixed with snow driven against the glass, and occasionally the howl of wind, which penetrated the chimney and scattered the ashes. A single candle placed behind the curtains lighted this dismal scene, and the irregular flicker of its flame cast weird reflections and dancing shadows on the walls of the alcove. There came a lull in the wind, the rain ceased, and during this instant of calm someone knocked, at first gently, and then sharply, at the outer door. Derues dropped the dying woman's hand and bent forward to listen. The knock was repeated, and he grew pale. He threw the sheet, as if it were a shroud, over his victim's head, drew the curtains of the alcove, and went to the door. "Who is there?" he inquired.
"Open, Monsieur Derues," said
a voice which he recognised as that of a woman of Chartres, whose affairs he managed, and who had entrusted him with sundry deeds in order that he might receive the money due to her. This woman had begun to entertain doubts as to Desrues' honesty, and as she was leaving Paris the next day, had resolved to get the papers out of his hands.
"Open the door," she repeated. "Don't you know my voice?"
"I am sorry I cannot let you in. My servant is out. She has taken the key and locked the door outside."
"You must let me in," the woman continued. "It is absolutely necessary I should speak to you."
"Come tomorrow."
"I leave Paris tomorrow, and I must have those papers tonight."
He again refused, but she spoke firmly and decidedly.
"I must come in. The porter said you were all out, but from the rue des Menetriers I could see the light in your room. My brother is with me, and I left him below. I shall call him if you don't open the door."
"Come in, then," said Desrues. "Your papers are in the sitting room. Wait here, and I will fetch them."
The woman looked at him and took his hand.
"Heavens, how pale you are! What is the matter?"
"Nothing is the matter. Will you wait here?"
But she would not release his arm, and followed him into the sitting room, where Desrues began to seek hurriedly among the various papers which covered a table.
"Here they are," he said. "Now you can go."
"Really,"
said the woman, examining her deeds carefully,
"never did I see you in such a hurry to give up things which don't belong to you. But do hold that candle steadily. Your hand is shaking so that I cannot see to read."
At that moment the silence which prevailed all round was broken by a cry of anguish, a long groan proceeding from the chamber to the right of the sitting room.
"What is that?" cried the woman. "Surely that is a dying person."
The sense of the danger which threatened made Desrues pull himself together.
"Do not be alarmed," he said. "My wife has been seized with a violent fever. She is quite delirious now, and that is why I told the porter to let no one come up."
But the groans in the next room continued, and the unwelcome visitor, overcome by terror, which she could neither surmount nor explain, took a hasty leave, and descended the staircase with all possible rapidity. As soon as he could close the door, Desrues returned to the bedroom. Nature frequently collects all her expiring strength at the last moment of existence. The unhappy lady struggled beneath her coverings. The agony she suffered had given her a convulsive energy, and inarticulate sounds proceeded from her mouth. Desrues approached and held her on the bed. She sank back on the pillow, shuddering convulsively, her hands plucking and twisting the sheets, her teeth chattering and biting the loose hair which fell over her face and shoulders.
"Water, water!"
she cried, and then,
"Edouard, my husband! Edouard, is it you?"
Then, rising with a last effort, she seized her murderer by the arm, repeating,
"Edouard! Oh!"
and then fell heavily, dragging Desrues down with her. His face was against hers. He raised his head, but the dying hand, clenched in agony, had closed upon him like a vice. The icy fingers seemed made of iron and could not be opened, as though the victim had seized on her assassin as a prey and clung to the proof of his crime. Desrues at last freed himself, and putting his hand on her heart, "It is over," he remarked. "She has been a long time about it. What o'clock is it? 9! She has struggled against death for 12 hours." While the limbs still retained a little warmth, he drew the feet together, crossed the hands on the breast, and placed the body in the chest. When he had locked it up, he remade the bed, undressed himself, and slept comfortably in the other one. End of Section 3. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.